And thank you to the witnesses for being here on this, what I think is a really important issue. My first question that I'd like to ask of Ambassador McFaul is this. We know that reports have recently come to light that Russian officials may have offered Taliban-linked militants bounties in exchange for killing American and NATO coalition forces. And obviously, this is truly disturbing news. But even more disturbing in some ways is that President Trump has not acted on these reports, despite the White House being aware of this scheme for months. And if true, these reports show an enormous escalation by an already aggressive adversary. So I guess my first question to you is, if these intelligence reports are accurate, what do you think President Putin would be seeking to gain by encouraging Taliban forces to attack American troops? And my second question is, what would be an appropriate response by the U.S. in view of these reports?
Two great questions, and I don't want to pretend I have a great answer to the first one. I follow what Mr. Putin does, but I don't have direct contact with him anymore. But to me, if I were to give a theory for what he's doing, remember, Putin sees us as the enemy. He wants to weaken the United States. He wants to foment disarray in the international system. He wants to see the collapse of NATO and even the liberal international order. He said this on the record. So anything that weakens us is good for him. And he sees the world in zero-sum terms. If it's +2 for Russia, it's -2 for the United States and vice versa. So I think he wants us to be bogged down in Afghanistan. I think he wants us to be fighting there. That has been good for him. And remember, this is just the latest escalation in other reporting we had, and I think you'll be talking to General Nicholson later in the week, of their escalatory engagement of the Taliban. So this is not a one-off thing. So that would be my interpretation there. He just wants us to be bogged down. With respect to response, again, if you're not willing to recognize the crime, then it's hard to talk about the punishment, right? And so I guess my plea would just be for the Trump administration to recognize what happened. And if it's not true, don't just put on a tweet that it's a hoax, but say that, for instance, it's been reported that this information was in the PDB on February 27th. That's an easily verifiable fact or not. It's been reported that there was a transfer of funds from a GRU bank account to a Taliban-controlled bank account. Is that true or not? That's an easily verifiable fact. And if it's true, then we should declassify that information and make sure that the world, all the American people, as well as all the Russian people, know that this is going on. Because if that is true, I want to underscore, sometimes we get too rational in our discussions of Putin. I want to say this with some emotion. If it is true, that means that the gentleman that our president just invited to come back to the G7 is putting bounties on the heads of U.S. American soldiers that signed up to defend and protect the United States of America. That is outrageous. And if it's not true, we need to learn that it isn't. But if it is true, we need to call it out for what it is, outrage, and we need to be outraged about it. And the president himself needs to make that statement. It is simply not enough for somebody else within the administration to say it, because that's exactly what Vladimir Putin is looking for. He said it many, many times. There's the deep state, right? People like me, people like Ambassador Fried and others. We're the ones like controlling what the good President Trump wants to do. The president of the United States, if this is true, needs to say that it is true. And then the consequences we can talk about later. But the first thing, he has to just admit the facts if they are true.
And do you believe that if that were admitted by this or some hypothetical administration, that further consequences would be warranted?
Absolutely. Yes, of course. Sanctions, as has been discussed before. Again, I want us to see, I want us to have a grand strategy for containing Putin's Russia. I think we sometimes get too reactive and tactical. That's what we did during the Cold War. By the way, the Cold War lasted a long, long time. 40 years, we had to maintain that strategy. It wasn't inevitable that we were going to win. And so I want to see us develop in a bipartisan manner and with our allies. You got to have both those things together. That's what we had during the Cold War, where we have multiple things we're doing simultaneously across the board, supporting NATO, supporting Ukraine. I'm quite worried about what's happening in Ukraine, by the way. That is not getting enough attention from the Trump administration. Keeping sanctions in place, only reducing them if Putin changes his behavior. Across the board, diversification of energy, re-engaging in multilateral institutions like the OSCE, like the Law of the Sea Treaty, the convention, that would help us in terms of containing Russia in the Arctic. In other words, we got to have a multiple pronged grand strategy, not just a one-off response here and there, I think, to be successful over the long haul.
And so, as I understand your answer, it requires that we have strong cooperative relations with our allies so that it's not just sanctions being imposed by the United States, correct?
Without question. We have no chance if we are not united with our allies in Europe. And I would say the liberal world, the liberal democratic world, as Ambassador Fried said in his remarks, we've got to re-engage to be the leader of the free world.
Well, you'll get no argument from me on that at all, Ambassador. I have one last question for you, and that is whether you have concerns about whether these reports, assuming them to be true, of bounties being offered to the Taliban, does it show an increasing level of Russian aggression toward the United States and a growing reliance, maybe this is a second part of the question, a growing reliance by Russia on proxy wars to spread its power?
Yes, I think there's an escalation here. And the only way we'll push Putin back is if we have a concentrated grand strategy to push back. But I also want to say another thing it shows. I want to be clear. I do not support the release of classified information to the press. I find that is not in America's national interest. And the level of detail that has been leaked suggests that the president is losing his own intelligence community. Think about what you must have to do. You go to jail to put the information in the New York Times. And that suggests a real discontinuity and a breakdown of our national security decision-making apparatus in the United States government. That also troubles me.
Thank you, Ambassador. I believe I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your grace in allowing me to finish that.